So I've lost the sound of the organizer, so I don't know exactly what I should do.
I'm just here. I was just okay.
Okay,
Yeah,
fine.
Yeah. So I'm just starting now. Okay. Good afternoon to everyone in India and also bonjour à tous to France. So we have a very distinguished speaker today with us. Professor Jean-Philippe Bousseau is a founder and chairman of the investment management firm Capital Funds Management, professor of physics at École Normale Supérieure, and co-director of the CFM Imperial Institute of Quantitative Finance at Imperial College London. He also teaches at Collège de France and is a member of the French Academy of Sciences. Professor Bousseau graduated from the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, where he also obtained his PhD in physics. Subsequently, he worked in the CNRS, the Cavendish Laboratory, and Sèvres-Châtelet. So Professor Bousseau has diverse interests. His work covers the physics of disordered and glassy systems, granular material, statistics of price formation, stock market fluctuation, and the modeling of financial risk. Professor Bousseau has authored more than 300 research papers, reviews, and several books. As many of us have learned about anomalous diffusion in disordered media from his physics report review, Professor Bousseau was awarded IBM Young Scientist Prize, CNR Silver Medal, Risk Quant of the Year for 2017. So today he is going to talk about marginally stable economics. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Bousseau for the talk. Over to you, Professor Bousseau.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to visit virtually Bangalore. I've never been to India before, so at least it gives me the occasion. And so I'm very happy to do this. And also I'm very sorry for the situation in India right now. France is not, great, but we really feel for you at this moment and do hope that it's going to get better soon. Anyway, so I'm going to give you some thoughts about a problem that we've been working on for several years with many people. Many of them are physicists, statistical physicists. Some of them are economists. And so the whole story that I'm going to tell you today, or try to tell you, is something that has taken time to mature and is clearly not yet the final answer. And in particular, of course, it's very difficult. The multidisciplinary research is extremely difficult. And so even if some economists are in this project, it's very, very hard to actually get the type of research that I'm going to talk about into main economist journals. And so there's a long way still to be made in order for this multidisciplinary project to get to fruition. So marginally stable economies, I'm going to try to explain the title. So essentially the main driver of all this research is e pur sui move, which is what Galileo said about the Earth. The idea here is that financial markets move all the time, as you know. I mean, actually, single stock prices move by something like 2% up or down every day, which is very large, actually. But even large economies like the US, and I've shown on the top graph here the year-on-year GDP growth since the 50s, and you see, huge fluctuations like minus 2.5%, plus 7.5%. So it's a highly, the mean is non-zero. I mean, the economy of countries tend to grow with time, but with very large fluctuations. And in both these cases, financial markets and large economies, these fluctuations are much too large to be explained by what economists call fundamentals. That is, if you want real reasons for prices to change and real reasons for economies to fluctuate. So, the excess volatility puzzle so I should try to get rid of this thing here. I don't know exactly how to do this because you don't see. Maybe I should leave the full screen mode. I don't know.
We can see it, I guess. Is there anything on the top?
You can see it, but I
Okay.
I can't. So is that still fine, or?
Yeah, it's okay.
It's better for me because now I see my full screen. Otherwise,
Oh.
I don't see the top line.
Okay.
Okay. Anyway, so if you see it well, I'm happier like this. So excess volatility in economic systems, this is also something called in the economics literature the business cycle, although it's not necessarily a cycle in the sense of a sine wave. And the argument for this volatility to be high is that people think that, in large economic systems, some firms should do well, some other firms should do badly, but all these idiosyncratic shocks should, in a sense, average out if you take large economies. It's in a sense a central limit theorem. The volatility should go down as one over square root of n. And so for very large economies like the US, you should see hardly any fluctuations at all. But as I've said, and as I've shown you in the graph, any measure of GDP growth, industrial production, whatever, it fluctuates a lot. And the numbers are 3% a year, plus or minus 2.5%. So this is called in economics literature, the small shocks, large business cycle puzzle. This was the sentence of Ben Bernanke a few years ago. And I'm quoting another economist in '94 who said, what shocks are responsible for economic fluctuations? Despite at least 200 years in which economists have observed fluctuation in economic activity, we still are not sure. So, it's in a sense, it's a strange situation. And if you look, for example, at the 2008 crisis, the reason for which we had such a big shock is still hotly debated. It's not clear whether there was a real reason or whether the whole system can go into kind of endogenous crisis that create volatility out of nothing. And indeed, if you look at standard models used by central banks, so there's an acronym here, DSG, which I won't even try to define, but this is a family of models that is extremely well known and extremely used in the both in academia and in institutions like central banks. Surprisingly, they do not accommodate endogenous crisis. There's the idea that there's an equilibrium, and fluctuations around this equilibrium are only caused coming from exogenous shocks. But the economy by itself cannot go haywire. So of course, exogenous shocks exist, like the COVID crisis we're stuck in right now, but that's about the only thing you can get in these frameworks. And as I've mentioned, surprisingly, the same puzzle also exists in financial markets. And strikingly, if you look at financial price series, you observe jumps, that is moments in the day, for example, when a stock moves by 4 sigmas or 5 sigmas or even 8 sigmas, and more often than not, these big jumps have no real cause. There's nothing in the newsfeed that can explain why these stocks have moved so much at that moment in time. So there's a little bit the same paradox in both contexts. Although today I'm not going to speak at all about financial markets, but more focus on economic systems. So as I've said, this small shocks, large business cycle is a puzzle, and people have tried to think about how to escape this hand-waving 1 over square root of n central limit argument that I've just given you. And so there are various routes. One that surprisingly has been advocated for the 2008 crisis is that there is a global shock, but we don't really know what it is, and we can't observe it, but there's a global shock kind of hidden, latent somewhere, that hits the economy, and that's the reason why it fluctuates, which is not a very satisfactory explanation. I think you'll agree on that. Another route, which is actually close to my heart and close to what statistical physics and anomalous diffusion has been about, for many years is the idea that Xavier Gabex and others have called granularity, which is the idea that if you look at the distribution of firm sizes, some firms are very small, but some firms are extremely large, and the distribution is a power law, which means that the central limit theorem may not apply as naively. And maybe fluctuations in the economy don't average out because the largest firms dominate these fluctuations. So that could mean that the fluctuations are actually regressing much slower than one over square root of n. So indeed, this helps. If you put numbers, you realize that a part of the reason why fluctuations are large is due to the fact that some firms are, Walmart, for example, is 3% of the US GDP. So it helps a little bit, but it doesn't bring the right order of magnitude still that we observe in terms of numbers. And plus, it doesn't sound right for example, for explaining the 2008 crisis, which is not a crisis induced by a few big firms going bust, but rather more of a systemic thing. So people have turned to another pretty obvious direction, which is to try to look for network effects, contagion effects, where the default or the problems of one firm would propagate to the whole network and lead to system-wide bankruptcies and things like that. So the idea of including networks in economic theories is actually not very old, and it picked up roughly around the 2008 crisis, for example, to model bank defaults or what's called deleveraging spirals in financial markets. And then there's a paper in '93 by physicists Purbach and economists Schenkman and Woodford, who have proposed following Purbach's ideas on sand piles and so on, that the concept of self-organized criticality, the fact that maybe an economy or a sand pile or many other examples, as you probably know, because Purbach tried to find many examples of this general concept, could lead to endogenous dynamics where small anecdotal shocks may bubble into something global because of the proximity of a critical point. So strong feedback effects internal to the system. So this is a very interesting route, although the paper by Bach, Schenkman, and Woodford was more of a kind of conceptual paper with a model that is not at all convincing because it's really a model of sand pile that is force fed into an economic context, but it's not very credible as a model. So what we have tried to do in the recent years is to try to find a more natural model, a model that's more palatable to economists and makes more sense even for non-economists, where the scenario of self-organized criticality of a possibility of purely endogenous dynamics makes more sense. And that's what I'm going to try to guide you through today. So instabilities in networked economies, I'm going to first describe to you the model that was proposed a long time ago by Long and Plosser, two economists, in 1983, but revived after the 2008 crisis by in a very famous paper in the field by Acemoglu, Carvalho et al. In 2010. And so it's a very classical model of interacting firms and households, and it's going to give you a flavor of how economists reason and what the limitations of these reasonings are and how one can go beyond that. So the idea is that firms belong to a network, an input-output network, and what you see here is actually a representation of the input-output network of the US economy. And so, for example, these three red points here are GM, Ford, and Chrysler, and you see the supplier and the customer links of the network. So the idea of an economic model is to assume that a firm produces stuff. So a firm will produce good I, and in order to do that, it has to use labor, L, and other goods that it buys from other firms. So Qij will be the amount of good J bought by firm I. And so in order to fix all these quantities and to describe the economy, what you have to do, if you follow the usual rational equilibrium or general equilibrium type of argument that economists like, is that the whole system, you don't exactly know how it does that, but this is going to be one of the points that I'm going to guide you through later, is that the economy finds an equilibrium where prices of all these goods and production levels, so prices Pi and production level pi I, are set by utility maximizations from households, profit maximizations from firms, and market clearing. Market clearing meaning that everything that's produced gets consumed. And so in all, you have prices and productions per product. So if you have n firms, you have 2n unknowns and 2n equations coming from profit maximization and market clearing. I'm going to show you a little more how it works. So in this in these classical papers that I've mentioned, what you assume is that firms produce some good according to what's called a production function. And the classical production function that economists use is called the Cobb-Douglas production function, at least in the papers I've just mentioned. And it's an equation that gives you how much good you can produce, pi I, in terms of the labor you use, Li to some power alpha, and then a product over all the goods that the intermediate good that you buy from other firms, Qij to some power 1 minus alpha Jij. And then in front of all this, there's a factor Zi, which is called productivity. And it means that labor and other goods being fixed, you can improve or decrease your production by some productivity gains. I don't know, better food for workers or whatever. So that's usually called technology. So okay, the Jij is not supposed to be positive or zero. There's a conventional normalization, and so the way it works is that now you see you have all the ingredients you need. The profit of firm I is given by the amount of goods it sells pi I times the price, because remember, we assume market clearing, so everything that's produced will get bought at price Pi. Then there's the labor that you have to pay at wage W, and then the products that you need to buy, and that's the money you spend buying these products. Okay, so with this equation for profit and the equation for production, you have enough ingredients to solve for equilibrium. So I won't go into the detail, but in the end, if you follow this route, assuming this Cobb-Douglas production function, what you find is that you have enough equations, as I've said, but for example, the equation for a quantity that's natural to interpret as sales, SI, which is a product of pi I times the prices, is the solution of an equation that's always well-defined, which is a matrix K, which is the identity times 1 minus alpha. Alpha was the parameter involved in the production function. You remember this little alpha here, it doesn't really matter too much, times the J matrix, the J being this matrix defining the network, the input-output network of the economy, applied to this vector S is equal to something that's related to the household preferences, how much households prefer good I over good J. All this is encoded in this theta vector. Anyway,
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, see this, when you say equilibrium, is it in the similar sense equilibrium when you talk in statistical mechanics, where between two nodes, so there's no detailed balance here, or
no, exactly. It's really more of a kind of a classical mechanics equilibrium.
Okay.
And I'll go later into this distinction. But here, if you want, you have an optimization problem, and the equilibrium is in terms of the solution to this optimization problem.
Okay.
So so here what you find, and again, don't worry too much about the details. The only thing I want to mention here is that with these assumptions on market clearing and profit maximization, and especially with this Cobb-Douglas production function, it turns out that the equilibrium is always well defined, in the sense that productions, pi i's, and prices, pi's, are always positive. And so you always find an acceptable equilibrium, if you want, a realizable equilibrium where all firms produce something positive and sell at a positive price. And as you're going to see, this is not at all something that's trivial, but it turns out that within this context, you indeed are able to always find an equilibrium that's acceptable. There's a simple random walk argument to ensure that the S here is a positive vector.
Sorry, a quick question. Does it have Nash equilibrium property that, no one has incentive to deviate from the decision that they're making?
Yes, yes. All these things are also included in these general equilibrium properties, that they're efficient in some sense and so on. Indeed. Okay, so the idea is to use this simple model to try to calculate fluctuations. And so what people do, and in particular this paper by Asimoglu, as I've mentioned, they assume that there are productivity shocks. And so remember, productivity shocks means that the ZI here is fluctuating over time. But they also assume that you immediately go back to equilibrium. So it's an assumption that in physics we would call adiabatic, in the sense that there are fluctuations in the external conditions, but equilibrium is reached immediately. So if you want, in this framework, the output or the utility of households is fluctuating in time, but it's really a succession of snapshots of equilibria. And so you can compute the variance of the GDP or whatever measure you want of the global economy. But remember, the variance there's no real dynamics here. It's a variance over the realizations of this productivity factor ZI, which is assumed to vary because of exogenous shocks. And so what you find in the end is that the variance of if you want GDP per capita is given by this expression here. So this is the sum of the cells square divided by the number of firms squared. And if the size of the companies measured by their sales is distributed with the mean, I mean, if this doesn't have fat tails, then this sum here is of order n, but it's divided by n squared, and so you recover the famous 1 over n for the variance, which is the central limit theorem. And so what you find is in a precise context, the hand waving 1 over square root of n argument that I was giving you at the very beginning. And so these people here, they know that this result is general, except if the network has some strange structure, like if there are hubs with many of order n connections with the rest of the economy, or if it's a power law network. But in this case, what you find is that because of the structure of the network, the distribution of the size of the equilibrium size of the companies is power law distributed. But then we're back to what Xavier Gabet was proposing. There's no real genuine cascade effect in this model. And so, as I said initially, indeed, this granularity hypothesis, the fact that this quantity may be actually much larger than 1 over square root of n, but still too small, is still holds. There's still a problem with this argument. And as I've said, there's something missing, which is a true idea of a shock propagating along the input-output network and creating these cascades that we feel, I guess, are crucial to understand the fluctuations of the global economy. So let me give you now a model with genuine instabilities, with a genuine idea of a cascade. And this is some work that's been published now in 2019 that we call May's instabilities in large economies. And I'll try to explain why Sir Robert May appears here. So the first thing that you can do is to say, well, this production function, I didn't even try to motivate it. I've just, given you the standard equation that people look at, this Cobb-Douglas production function. But what if we change the production function to something else? And so another very famous production function is called the Leontief production function, which is that the production is some productivity factor times the min over j's, over the input goods you need, of the ratio of qij over some jij. And so here the idea, if you want, in a nutshell, is that if you want to build a car, you need 4 tires. And so if, whatever the rest of steel that you have, if you don't have your 4 tires, you won't be able to make a car. So this is the idea that some goods are non-substitutable, and it's encapsulated in this simple Leontief production function. And so you can redo the whole calculation, assuming everything else the same as the model that I've just given you, or at least flashed the equilibrium arguments. And so you can again solve all the equations. And I'm going to try to tell you that now the situation is going to be very different. Anyway, before doing this, there's actually a full family of production functions that is introduced in the economic literature, which is called constant elasticity of substitution, and is parameterized by some parameter that I've called Q here. So it doesn't matter the actual detailed shape, which is written here. What you should remember is that the limit Q going to 0 is the Leontief production function that I just flashed, the one where there's this idea that some goods, that the goods are not substitutable. If you miss one of them, you can't build what you want to build. And the limit Q goes to infinity is the Cobb-Douglas. So that it's a way to interpolate continuously between Leontief and Cobb-Douglas. So it's a very nice mathematical trick if you want. But the problem is that there's no real justification of these production functions, which is also something that as a physicist you find strange when you read economics papers, is that there's a lot of theories built around these production functions, but except the Leontief, where I think it's pretty obvious what it means, as soon as Q is non-zero, it's much harder to come up with a microscopic scenario that would lead to these production functions. But okay, leaving that aside for the moment, because we're not going to revolutionize all the aspects of economics theory in one go. Let's take that as granted and see how much we're going to be able to play with these production functions. And what I'm going to tell you now is going to hold for any value of Q except the Cobb-Douglas. So the whole story about instabilities and self-organized criticality that I'm going to tell you about is actually not related to the fact that I'm looking at the Leontief production function, which you could think is a singular point. It's actually the Cobb-Douglas production function, which is a singular point. And the reason is that if you write down for the Leontief production function the zero profit and market clearing equilibrium, then what you find are equations that have that shape. It's a matrix applied on the vector of P's of prices, which is equal to second to a right-hand side, which is a positive vector. And gammas are essentially the productions, the pi's. And so there's another equation, which is the same matrix transposed equal to some other vector of positive entries. So you have, again, 2n equations for 2n unknowns. And these equations are, in the Leontief case, extremely simple. They're essentially linear equations. You have to invert a matrix and it's transposed to get the solution. But at this point, you have to remember that in order to make sense, the solution of these equations, of these linear equations, have to be positive. The prices cannot be negative and productions cannot be negative. They can maybe be zero. That's going to be important. They clearly cannot be negative. And at this stage, what's interesting and is if you look at these equations, they actually are the same equations that you get in a completely different context, which is an ecological context, and Cavalterra will know but actually you can generalize these Lot-Cavalterra equations to n species and pairwise beneficial, detrimental. And the Lot-Cavalterra equations are that the evolution of the populations, not the price, in this case, the number of individuals in species I, is given by some fitness and some term coming from the interaction with others. So the fitness is if it's large, then the population of I grows quickly. But if it interacts in a detrimental way with other species, then the growth can even turn negative. And so you see immediately that if you look for the equilibrium of these large ecologies, you have to find a solution of an equation which is a certain matrix applied on P equals some minus the vector of A, which has exactly the same form. I mean, of course, the definition of J is slightly different, but it has the same algebraic structure of having to inverse a matrix and apply it to some positive vector. And what we know from what we've learned recently, actually from the investigation of these large ecology problems, is that equilibrium is only possible in the sense that obviously the populations must all be found to be positive or zero. Then equilibrium is only possible if only some species survive. You cannot generically have all species surviving and finding a positive solution to these equations. So the only way to get a reasonable equilibrium, a realizable equilibrium, is actually to kill part of the species and to let the other survive. And actually what people find is that in many of these models, the system spontaneously evolved towards a marginally stable point where the stability matrix has an eigenvalue that touches zero, which means that the whole ecology is extremely sensitive to perturbation. So this leads to ideas like punctuated equilibria and mass extinctions and so on. And if you're interested, you can, of course, go back to Sir Robert May's paper in 1972, which was called Will Large Complex Stable Systems Be Stable? And again, it's a little bit the inspiration for the present work in the context of economic systems. And then there's a very recent, more statistical physics paper by Biroli, Boone, and Camarota that is extremely inspiring and interesting. Anyway, coming back to my problem, actually, this problem of the existence of a solution was considered in the 40s by two economists, Hawkins and Simons, and they showed that there are conditions for finding positive solutions, which is that this matrix that I'm calling M now, which is a diagonal term containing productivity factors, ZIs, and minus this Jij, which describes the network, it's only leading to acceptable solutions when all the eigenvalues, all the real parts of the eigenvalues of this matrix are positive. And when one touches zero, then the economy becomes what I call marginally stable, in the sense that beyond that point, you have to kill some firms in a sense. And so I'm going to try to motivate the idea of why the economy could be spontaneously lying close to such a point where the lowest eigenvalue touches zero. One is exactly like in the Robert May's paper, is that if you increase the size of the system, everything else being the same, then naturally the system will run into this instability. So I'm going to give you a small argument in a second, but just increasing n typically will lead the system to touch, the lowest eigenvalue of m to touch 0. You can actually change a little bit the assumptions. As I've said, the economists think that the economy is competitive, and so all the firms can do nothing but zero profits, which is clearly not the case in real economies. And you can extend a little bit the model by saying that firms try to make some profit, and so they apply to prices what's called the markup, which is they increase the price a little bit above within the same context is that as firms become more greedy, they're going to drive the whole network towards this instability point. It's also the case when the connectivity of the network increases, and this can be thought of as a complexification of the production processes. If you need more inputs to produce what you're good, then typically you're going to drive the network again towards this critical point. And finally, as I've said, this, although the Hawkins Simons is only true for the Leontief production function, you can extend this criterion, and what you find is that for any Q except infinity, except for the Cobb-Douglas case that I've given you in the very first version of the model, this instability exists. And what you can find is that as Q decreases, as goods in a sense become less and less substitutable, then the economy will hit at one point this critical point. And so you see all these scenarios here are very plausible in terms of how the economy evolves with time. People tend to be more greedy. Processes tend to get complex. Firms try to have lean supply chains. And so in a sense, they're more and more vulnerable to the fact that one of their supplier goes bust, and the whole thing can become unstable because of that. Okay, May's instability, I see time is running, so I won't spend a long time on this, but there's a simple argument that shows how this idea that when you add an extra firm, this is typically a kind of statistical mechanics type of arguments, a cavity-like argument, is that if you add an extra firm, you can show that the whole system is brought closer to instability. So that was May's insight in '72. You can also look at concrete models because all this was very abstract. So, for example, if you have a simple what's called regular random networks, which each firm connected randomly with C suppliers and C customers, with the input coefficients J, the stoichiometric coefficients we would call in chemistry, like 4 for tires, and the number of items you need to build one of your own good. For J's and Z constant, then you can compute the smallest eigenvalue of this M matrix, and what you find is that it's proportional to, it's equal actually in this case to the productivity of the economy minus something that describes exchanges, the network. And of course, this is a very, very naive model for the actual input-output network, but it already captures the fact that as the economy becomes less productive, or as the number of suppliers and customers increases, then lambda min is going to decrease and hit 0 at some stage. So you can do all sorts of variations on this model by, for example, keeping the directed random regular network of customers and suppliers, but now having productivities that are not equal, but random between Z minus W and Z plus W, W being the width of the span of productivities per firm. And what you find here, actually, the model is very close to a model that has been studied in the context of statistical physics. And what you find is an interesting phase diagram with a transition between extended eigenvalues of the matrix and localized states. I won't go too much into the details. What I want to emphasize here is that as you increase the strength of the disorder, as we would call it in physics, as you increase the spread of productivities, you can go from a case where the lowest eigenvalue is detached from the bulk and is delocalized, which means in the context of the economic model, that if you have a crisis, it's going to be a global crisis where all firms go bust simultaneously, to a case where the lowest eigenvalue actually touches the bulk and becomes localized. And in this case, you have a much more interesting phenomenology, with crises being parallel distributed, in the sense that some crises may be small and other crises may be large. And so if you draw the distribution of firm sizes and size of the avalanches, if you want, in the sense, if one firm goes bust, how many firms are going to be induced into failure because of that? Then you find these nice power laws that we like in statistical physics, that are extremely relevant, because indeed, as I've mentioned above, firm size are extremely broadly distributed in practice and resemble a nice power law. So what's interesting about this model is that although the network is not a power law network, it's not a question of connectivity of the firms that is broad, is the fact that you get close to an instability that leads to these power laws. So again, the idea here is that the firm size turns out to be power law, but it was not built in the model. Anyway, so in order to conclude this section here, what we find is that there are a lot of arguments that suggest that the economy may spontaneously run into an instability. And if it's close to an instability, if it remains close to this instability, it remains close to an instability because if it grows and hits this threshold, then some firms will have to disappear, and the system will, in a sense, self-stabilize around the critical size that it can reach. So it's a reasonably plausible mechanism that would explain why there's this excess volatility in large economies, because you're close to a critical point. But note that here I'm still in the context of this adiabatic assumption that I've described. Each time step, I'm computing an equilibrium without at all worrying about the speed at which an equilibrium would be reached. And so what we tried to do more recently, and so you can look at this paper here, Out of Equilibrium Dynamics in Firm Networks, with 2 students, Theo Desserten and Jose Moran and Michael Benzaken. This is on arXiv, where we tried to extend this model and introduce some dynamics. So as I've said, postulating that the economy is in a succession of equilibrium states is only justified if the time to equilibrate is fast enough compared to shocks and other changes. But how do we know this? How fast do imbalances, for example, how fast do supply and demand equilibrate? Is it a microsecond? Surely not. Is it a century? Probably not. So it's probably in between. But if it's a year or two, or if it's a month or two, then we're in the time scale region where the speed of adjustments is relevant to the dynamics we want to model. And actually, as I've shown you, in some models, equilibrium doesn't even exist. So what happens in these circumstances when you can't even rely on equilibrium? There must be, it must be the case that the system is doing something, and it's doing something that's purely dynamics because there's no equilibrium to be reached. So clearly, in order to have a more realistic framework, we need to extend these usual equilibrium arguments that economists consider and try to introduce some true dynamics in the model. And at this stage, it becomes extremely complicated to do it the way economists would like to do it, because they the economists insist on rationality and on the fact that agents optimize a utility function, forward-looking utility function. So these problems become extremely hard to solve analytically, and also very unreasonable from a point of view of what people do in practice. So there's another branch of this dream of making everything consistent from a theoretical point of view with all these nice results that we evoked earlier about optimality and efficiency and so on, and adopt a more kind of phenomenological approach to what may be going on, assuming that people use reasonable rules of thumb to adapt to new situations, perhaps learning and things like that, but try to remove the yoke of rationality, which I think is a very heavy constraint on the models, and have slowed down, in my view, progress in economics. And we know in physics, we don't shy away from doing these type of jumps from intuition to equations. And we know this is a sentence that I've added for economists, but I guess physicists are all familiar with the idea that phenomenological approaches are very fruitful, like the Navier-Stokes, which was written much before we even understood where it was coming from. Anyway, so you can try to do that, and if you do that, if you make a very naive phenomenological approach to try to make the models I talked about, to endow them with some dynamics, what you assume is that there are kind of restoring forces that are proportional to imbalances. So, for example, if there's a profit, if a firm makes a profit, there will be a force driving back the profit to zero. And if you assume the force to be linear, then maybe that's reasonable, close to equilibrium. And if you do the same for supply and demand, if you assume that if there's more supply, then demand will follow, and so on, in a linear way, then you very quickly led, again in a phenomenological manner, to equations of that type, where U is the vector of deviation of prices and productions from equilibrium. So it's a 2n vector. So it's pi I minus pi I equilibrium at time t, and pi of t minus pi equilibrium. And what you find is, of course, a linear equation, because that's what you've assumed. So there's no miracle here. So this vector U evolves according to some linear operator D on U matrix, 2n by 2n, and a noise term that represents these exogenous shocks, technology, consumptions, and so on. So what's interesting?
The eigenvalues of D is negative.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm going to say in a second. Okay. So if you do this for the model that I've talked about earlier, the LyonSkip model, what you find is that the dynamical matrix D inherits, it's not exactly the same as M, but inherits some of the properties of the matrix M. And in particular, as you just mentioned, the eigenvalues of D are, roughly speaking, minus the eigenvalues of M. And so if equilibrium is reachable, if equilibrium makes sense, then all the eigenvalues of D are negative. And so not only equilibrium makes sense, but it's also stable. But by the same token, if you buy my argument that maybe naturally the economy goes to this marginal point where it's barely stable anymore, then the smallest eigenvalue of D, the less negative one, if you want, touches zero. So you have at the same time the fact that the economy becomes unstable, and the fact that the time that you need to wait for the equilibrium to be reached will diverge, because of course the lowest eigenvalue of D is governing the time scale for reaching equilibrium. So what you find is that in this context, the time to equilibrium becomes large, by the same token as you've approached a singular point, it becomes large and invalidates the adiabatic sequence of equilibrium assumption that people use. And the second interesting thing is that you can find that the fluctuations of U are essentially the fluctuations of psi, the exogenous shocks, but multiplied by something like the inverse of the smallest eigenvalue of D. And so because you're close to a critical point, you can also have this amplification of the volatility of external shocks, which is, as I recall, the main motivation of this work, this puzzle that even if shocks are small, even if the 2008 crisis, the initial shock was small, somehow you get huge fluctuations in the global economy, and that could be a natural consequence of sitting close to an instability point, and that's what these simple equations already capture. The fact that adiabaticity is not for granted. It assumes something that may not be true, and the second thing is that you can have amplification of fluctuations. Okay, so at this stage we were already quite happy, but then we realized that if you drill a little further into the dynamics, this naive dynamics, again using naive arguments that forces are proportional to imbalances, which is something that if you want, it's the Onsager idea in non-equilibrium statistical mechanics. What you find very quickly is that it violates what I've called incontrovertible constraints here. It violates things like consumptions can never be larger than production at an instant of time. I mean, you can't consume more than what's been produced and stored. Obviously, storage must be, as soon as you don't have supply equal demand, then you have to introduce storage, inventories. But clearly, you cannot at one instant of time consume more than what is there. And if you look at the model, at the naive model, it violates these constraints. It also violates constraints like causality. Things cannot be consumed before they're produced and things like that. And so we realized that this idea of creating a phenomenological model for the dynamics was much more constrained than what we thought. And we had to work much more to actually build something that respects constraints that you don't want to violate, like causality and consumptions smaller than what's out there. And so I'm not going to describe this model. You can go and look at the paper if you want. They're again built on plausibility and phenomenological arguments. But what you find in the end is a much richer model that that is never linear, really. It's only piecewise linear, even for small perturbations. And the only thing I'm going to show you is how rich the model, this naive model, this extended naive model turns out to be. So, for example, I'm showing you here a phase diagram in the space of parameters of the model, where on the x-axis is essentially the strength of these restoring forces that I've talked about, which are still parts of the model, but in a more refined way. And on the y-axis, how fast goods perish. So how quickly your inventories are they going to be still present on the next time step, or have they perished completely? And so what you find is numerically at this point, because we don't have a theory yet, you find a surprisingly rich phase diagram where in some cases, so what you have to realize is that in all this case, in the whole phase diagram here, there is a well-defined equilibrium in the sense of economists, but in some cases you can reach it. So for example, in this blue phase here, you actually reach equilibrium, the equilibrium of economists after a finite time. So this is the relaxation Tau's equilibrium that you see. But in other phases, you find that the economy explodes completely or enters a sequence of spontaneous booms and busts, which can be periodic or chaotic. I mean, again, it's surprisingly rich. The fact that the model with very few assumptions is able to produce something like completely endogenous fluctuations. In this case, you don't even need to drive the system by exogenous shocks. By itself, it fluctuates in all sorts of ways. And so now we have another scenario for this large business cycle, small shock puzzle, which is not an amplification of external shocks, but simply the fact that by itself the system, is creating its own dynamics through feedbacks and lack of coordination. So here is again another example of the kind of dynamics that you can have, where the system seems stable for a long time and then has these completely endogenous crises that pop up out of nowhere. Oh, by the way, if you want to play with the code, there's a link here, and you can yourself experiment. So as conclusion, I'd like first to quote Olivier Blanchard, who was head of the IMF, head economist of the IMF. So he's I would say, traditional economist. But in 2014, he reflected on the 2008 crisis and wrote this piece, which I really strongly recommend, called Where Danger Lurks, that you can find on the net. And he says, we in the field did think of the economy as roughly linear, constantly subject to different shocks, constantly fluctuating, but naturally returning to equilibrium over time. So if you remember, that's the DSGE models that I've quoted at the beginning of the talk, where there is a well-defined equilibrium and fluctuations are only due to external shocks, but they tend to mean revert. And he says the main lesson of the crisis is that we were much closer to dark corners, situations in which the economy could badly malfunction than we thought. And what I've tried to propose today is a framework where you can see these dark corners. You can see, for example, that in some cases, this phase diagram, that there are well-defined phases where the economy functions as it should, but as you reach these, what Blanchard would call dark corners, the whole thing can go haywire. So, I've said what I wanted to say essentially. This is just summarizing and rehashing what I've just said. Try to propose an explicit model for this self-organized critical scenario proposed a long time ago in a very artificial model. Now we have a model that at least is reasonable from an economics point of view. And I've tried to argue that there are many reasons for the economy to sit close to the critical point. But then when you add dynamics, you don't even need to be close to a critical point. That's something maybe that I haven't insisted on. Here, you're pretty far from the critical point, but spontaneously, the system can still have these crazy types of dynamics. So at this point, I think it's a question of empirical data analysis. We should try to think about ways to separate these two scenarios. Is the dynamics due to some proximity of the critical point, or is the dynamics due to a complete breakdown of coordination that makes it impossible to reach equilibrium? So at this stage, I think this is a completely open question, and I think I'm right on time. Thank you for listening, and of course, I'm open to questions now.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very wonderful talk. Yeah, I guess you can take questions now from the audience.
So I don't know if I was super clear or super boring.
So actually, I have a question. Hello?
Yeah,
Yeah,
please
sure.
go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you for the very nice talk, first of all. My question was that when you're considering these dynamics, I understood you were, is it like, your firms in the network remains fixed in the sense that there are not going to be any new companies or diversification, speciation, like drawing parallel from ecology, like something they call a sympatric speciation, like one company bifurcating into two companies, and that's going to alter the dynamics a bit?
No, yeah, it's a beautiful question. I mean, this is what we're working on right now, is that, for example, at this point, we have a problem when the dynamics drives the prices to negative values. And we have to decide what we want to do. And so clearly we want to kill the firm and replace it by another firm, or at least rewire the network, because in particular in the case of a Leontief production function, you see that if one of your supplier goes bust, then you cannot produce anymore, which can happen. And actually, there's a very interesting where some, and actually the same happened in the COVID crisis not long ago, where or when the Suez Canal got blocked, is that it really creates problem, but on a longer time scale, what firms do is to rewire. They actually look for another supplier. And so all this dynamics of the network itself, including your question, including addition of new firms, what are the rules with which we're going to wire this new firm with others, or bankruptcy of a firm, or maybe splitting of a firm, or mergers of firms, all this which affect the dynamics of the network itself has not been considered. So here, everything I've shown, in particular these phase diagrams here, they are assuming that the network is static. And of course, this is, on the short time scale, this is okay, but on a longer time scale, it's clearly not. And so we're trying to exactly work along the lines that you've mentioned, but this becomes even more complicated because you have a double, you have a couple dynamics of the firms in the network and of the network itself. So I think at one point we'll need some kind of simplification principle or organizing principle, and maybe numerically we'll find that the networks that are spontaneously created are special in some sense, and that will be extremely interesting. As I've told you, that there is data on actual input-output networks. So one of the far aim of all these studies would be to have a model that's rich enough to explain why the input-output networks evolve into something like this.
I see. Thank you. Thank you.
I have this question.
Hello.
So you showed these eigenvalues which are scattered in a complex plane, right? And you're looking at a minimum eigenvalue. So is there anything like this random matrix laws here, like residuum there? Or?
Yeah, okay. So here is actually, so the problem with empirical data is that it's only partial. And in the empirical data, so this is, I haven't even commented on this curve, which was just meant as an illustration, but actually this curves here, these data points come from the actual diagonalization of a partial input-output matrix coming from the US economy, where we only have the links. Links are binary variables. They're either 0 or 1, but they don't carry a weight. And so what you see here is not completely far from the simple model that I've described, where of a random regular network. In a random regular network, there's an isolated eigenvalue, a unique isolated eigenvalue, Z minus JC, and then a sea of complex eigenvalues, which is in a disk of radius J square root of C. And so this is a kind of random matrix theory result. And okay, if you look at this, well, first of all, it's not the complete picture because, as I've said, we don't have the amplitude of the J's. But there's something that resembles a kind of semicircle, and then something that there are more than one isolated eigenvalue. So at this stage, we don't have enough data to know whether in which universality class of random matrix theory would be, and so on. And what I've said on top of that is that here, not only we don't have the amplitude of the J's, but we don't even have the Z's. So this is assuming that all Z's are constant. But as I've said, And again, this is, you can see as a result of kind of random matrix theory, depending on the amount of randomness or the fluctuations in the productivity, you see you can have two very different universality classes. One where this eigenvalue is isolated, and one where it actually touches the band edge and disappears. This is now called the BBP transition, Baig Ben Arous Péché, and was first computed by these three mathematicians maybe 10 years ago.
Sumon, you have a question? Please go ahead.
Yes. So actually, I wanted to check two things. First, when we are talking about this dynamical model, so we have this exogenic shocks in the form of this xi. So I'm just I wanted to know means what is the role of means whether this which form of exogenic shocks lead to the pink noise that generally appear in the context of this economic catastrophes.
So, well, here, of course, you can choose xi the way you want. But what's interesting is that because it's mediated with D, even if the xi is white, you will have pink noise because it goes through D if you want. Is that
yes,
the nature of your question, or?
And I have actually
you see,
one
because the eigenvalues of D can be small, then you're dressing the noise xi, which you can assume to be white, and it's going to be pink if you look at U. The fluctuations of U are going to have a non-trivial spectrum in frequency space.
Yes, thank you.
You had another question? Yes.
Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
Okay. So I just wanted to just think about the recent days situation, the recent days economy, where means whether do you think that this economy is in the self-organized critical state or weakly chaotic, because we have the exogenous shocks in the form of COVID, and also we have heavy profit making by the technological sector, and the debt market is somewhat stressed, very much like what we had before the dot-com bubble.
Yes, and your question is?
Do you think now we are approaching a marginally stable economy?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's clear that these imbalances are huge, and so we are clearly not in an equilibrium state. That's for sure. And you know, the question is: are we always close to an instability, or are we, you know, sometimes further away from it? And as I've said, what at this point, I cannot really conclude, because as I've tried to say, which is maybe not satisfactory at this point, but I can't, you know, be better than that, is that we have two scenarios, and the two scenarios are qualitatively in agreement with the phenomenology. One is that the economy gets close to this critical point, which might be the case now, as you suggest, but it's always not far away from it. And so that's why we see these spikes. But maybe we're in that situation where here this graph is, as I've said, that we're actually quite far from this instability point, but dynamically the system is not able to find the equilibrium. So the equilibrium exists in this whole phase. I mean, everywhere in this plane, the equilibrium exists, and it's stable. You know, if you measure the eigenvalue, it's of order 1. The smallest eigenvalue is of order 1. It's not even small, but you can still have intricate dynamics that lead to these large business cycles with no shocks. So, you know, I'm sorry not to be able to give you the final answer, and I really would love to know whether, well, first of all, if this whole picture makes sense, but whether the economy is more of that type, and it's fluctuating because of endogenous, you know, coordination of different firms that, you know, cannot, you know, agree to find the equilibrium, or whether we're actually close to equilibrium. But as you've seen here, you can have these incredible crises while being far from the instability point. It's just a dynamical instability, if you want. So in order to, I mean, I don't know if I answered your question. As a layman, I'm pretty, worried about what's going on right now with bubbles everywhere, and I don't know how sustainable is the financial market rally and so on, and accumulating debts and so on. So I think we're in a period of incredible imbalances everywhere. But this is not a scientific answer. Within the context of my model, I can only say that we have two scenarios, and I don't know which one is most plausible.
So what do you have a question?
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks for a very, very interesting talk. I think I, for one, have never thought about these questions in quite the same way. But I had a question which has to do with what's called the whole, the scandals of offshoring and the entire economy, which is sort of the dark economy, which we don't hear much about. And it seems to me that that's a significant, at least from what one has read, a significant sector of the current capitalist system. And how would you take into account something of that sort? I mean, apart from sort of stochastic noise of some kind, they seem to be significant for, and I'm referring to things like, the crisis, which was the Panama Papers that came out, things of that sort. I mean, I'm a complete layperson as far as economics is concerned, but I'm wondering how, when there's so much that's hidden in the system, how would you model such data? Or do you think that it's irrelevant to this open economy, that supposedly open economy that we're part of? Thank you.
Yeah, I have to say it's something I haven't thought about very deeply, and again, I think at this stage, economy is built on assumptions that look so crazy to me, that I've tried to allude to, like the idea that the economy reaches an equilibrium that's on top of it because of mathematical reason, kind of optimal, Pareto optimal. Nobody can be better off without someone else being worse off, and all these beautiful results that have fascinated economists for 60 years or so, that are based on very, very strong assumptions. And these assumptions are so crazy that at this point, I think it's what's important is to change the paradigm and show that if you remove some of these assumptions, if you start creating models that are not completely waterproof from either from empirical point of view or from a kind of axiomatic point of view, but that in a physicsy way, you try to create models that show a lot of the phenomenology that you would like to see. And I think that's what I've tried to show today, that the fact that you have a model that's at the same time simple enough, but rich enough to produce all kinds of crazy scenarios that may fit a time series much better than simple models where the equilibrium is always stable and you always relax back there. That at this point, these are incredibly simplified models, and this input-output model that I've showed, it neglects all sorts of effects that I think are much more important than the one that you suggest. So at the end of the day, maybe in 20 years' time, if we have enough control on what's going on, we can include more and more details and get closer and closer to reality. But at this point, I can give you one example, is that in this model, there is no stock market, there's no bond market, there's no debt, so there's no banking sector. And I think that introducing these into the model would be the first step in order to get closer to realism. So I think these are still very much toy models, And I'm, at this point, I haven't tried to calibrate any of this on actual data because I think it's much too premature. I think the idea is to get the basic phenomena right and then build on them to be closer to reality. But I think we're still very far from that. And as I've said, and as we've seen, financial markets can induce instabilities by themselves and feedback on the economy. Bond markets, debt, all this is crucial. Government debt. There's something else that's missing, is that our households in this model are extremely simple. They are very naive. They're optimizing a utility function, but there's nothing like, panic of the household sector that would stop consuming or, hoarding money or things like that we know is also a channel for instabilities of economic systems. So I think compared to physics, we're still so far from getting the fundamentals right that something that you talk about, which is in a sense a detail. I'm not saying we should not be worried by these effects, but I think it's still very, very far from the point that I wanted to make.
Thank you. That was really clarifying. Thank you very much.
Ion, you have a question? Okay, there's a question from Ion. He says, are the equilibrium in the network analysis and dynamic framework equivalent?
Yes, exactly. I mean, for example, here, this equilibrium here, the equilibrium that you reach, is exactly the static equilibrium. But so the model is constructed to respect the static equilibrium of the model. I mean, the standard economic equilibrium, if you want. But as we show here, the issue is not about the existence of this equilibrium. It's about its dynamical reachability. And somehow the system, although the equilibrium is there, is just lost. It dynamically cannot coordinate to reach it, which I think is interesting. By the way, you see, in order to get a little more intuition, I'm sorry I had to rush through at the end, but the intuition is that as you increase the strength of the restoring forces, you might naively think that it's easier to reach equilibrium, because every time that you go away from equilibrium, there's a strong force getting you back to it. But the problem is too strong. And so people are kind of overreacting all the time, or firms in this case, they're overreacting to the signal. And because they're overreacting, they're sending wrong signals to other, and coordination breaks down. I mean, it breaks down not entirely, because you can build these nice cycles, but it breaks down in the sense that collectively the system is not able to reach equilibrium. And it can break down completely in the sense that dynamics become chaotic. So what would be interesting, and what we're trying to pursue also at this stage, is to have a little more analytic understanding of this phase diagram, because this is purely numerical, and for the moment we have no idea of how to simplify the model enough to make an analytical prediction for these phase diagrams. We have partial results, but they're very far from definitive yet.
Okay, I guess we'll take the last question. Jitendra, you have a question?
Yeah, hi sir. Thanks for the nice talk. So I had this small, maybe you already mentioned it, but since these systems are so complicated, is there any random matrix theory approach on studying this? Is the capital D matrix which you showed random in some sense?
Yes. Okay. So that's a little bit what I've answered already. If you look at this D model, it's inherited from M. So if you know M, you know D essentially, and so you can make the same kind of assumptions on D that you make on M. And so, for example, this kind of model is, I think, the simplest one, a model where the network itself is directed random regular, so there's no real disorder in the topology of the network. Every firm has exactly C suppliers and exactly C customers, but there's no neighborhood. It's the way they connected is random, and the only randomness is in the productivities. And already, but this is transposed from physics. This is a well-known problem. This is a localization on beta lattices. Then there's a lot of things that are unknown. Now, I guess that was one of the earlier questions. Can you find other interesting classes of random matrix to do something? It's very possible, but we haven't investigated that much yet.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll end. Okay, thank you very much again for this wonderful talk. And okay.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I hope